Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about North American civilizations that existed before the arrival of Europeans. Civilizations, as the word implies, that had fully formed cities that weren't so different from what you'd find throughout the rest of the world at the time. Cities that people abandoned over time, long before the Europeans' arrival. My guest for this is Kathleen DuVal. Kathleen DuVal is a professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and she is the author of the book Native Nations, a Millennium in North America. Kathleen DuVal, it is my very good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mitch. I'm delighted to be here.
I should probably clarify. I realize this as reading my introduction. I say civilizations in North America, and of course, Mexico is part of North America. And I want to clarify, we're actually not going to necessarily be talking a lot anyways about the Aztecs or the Olmecs or the Mayans or Toltecs or many of the great civilizations of Mexico. We're actually going to be talking about even cities and civilizations that existed within the bounds of what we call modern United States.
That's right. It was especially important to me not to include places like central Mexico, peoples like the Aztecs and the Mayas, because I think most of us know something about them. And to make that point, as you say, that there were civilizations to the north of that. So in this book about North America, it does include northern Mexico, what's now the continental United States, and sort of southern Canada, that there were civilizations that had some things in common in that part of North America.
Of course, because these borders that we now recognize come much, much later. So that's
Right.
not surprising. The year 1054 is your starting point. Tell me the importance of the year 1054. And there's a supernova occurring in the sky that has captured the world's imagination, all the entire world, but also what you find in North America.
Right. One of the difficulties of studying this part of North America, north of central Mexico, in the periods before Europeans arrived, is that there aren't written records that we have. And there may have been some people who wrote things down, but there aren't written records that we have for those civilizations. And one of the things that's really nice about this supernova of 1054 is that we know that everybody was thinking about it, everybody was talking about it, whether they kept written records or not. So we have records that did survive from China and Japan and India, Western Europe and North Africa, places where people recorded what they thought when they saw this supernova, this star, and they didn't call it a supernova, this star that was so bright you could see it during the day. People said it was brighter than the moon at night, and it lasted for almost a year. And so we know people thought it was really important. And this was a time where all over the world, sort of celestial signals were important, right? Sometimes people changed their way of life or thought it was a sign from God or the gods or the spiritual world when something so unusual like this star happened. And what we see in North America is, even though we don't have records for what people thought, there's some things that actually changed in North America right after that. There was a supernova in 1054 and then another one just over a decade later. And that's the time when we see in the Mississippi Valley the rise of the great city of Cahokia, which was across the Mississippi River from what today is St. Louis. And also an accelerated period of building and centralization in multiple civilizations of the Southwest in what's now Arizona and New Mexico. And it seems like it had something to do, the change is so sudden that it may have had something to do with, especially seeing these two bright, long-lasting stars kind of in a row in the lifetimes of people.
So through the archaeological record, then we see great development occurring within the bounds of the modern day United States, as you mentioned, near St. Louis and in Arizona, right around at the time of these supernovas that were visible to everyone at night. As you said, brighter than the moon.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So I think, it was People may have decided to live differently. Powerful leaders, it's possible, used this sign in the sky to increase their power, to get people to do the kind of building work that was required to build a city, before there are power tools of any kind, much less the kind of construction equipment that would build parts of a city today. And so I used that to open the book, as I think it was important historically, but also because one of the points of this book is that very, very often, when we think about world history, or if you open a world history textbook or take a world history class, our part of North America is left out of it. It probably will mention the Mayas, it'll mention the Aztecs and the Incas, but our part of North America, north of central Mexico, doesn't really appear in world history until Europeans get here. And I think that's really wrong, right? Native Americans lived their own history, and it had things in common with the rest of the world at its time period. So one of the purposes of this book is to make sure people get rid of that old stereotype of Native Americans as being primitive, as being behind the rest of the world. Because if you look at this time period, starting a millennium ago, and of course going earlier than that, if you do that too, but in the book, starting a millennium ago, there are things happening in North America that are very similar to what's going on in the rest of the world. So if you look at, say, a world history textbook for this period, for the 1000s and the 1100s, you'll see beginnings of agricultural revolutions, the kind of large-scale agriculture that makes building cities possible, continent-wide trade networks. That if you look at a history book that includes Africa and Europe and Asia, that's what you'll see. But it's also what was going on in North America. These cities like Cahokia, like the cities of the Hohokam in Arizona, were being built, were growing, and they had wide trade ties with other peoples, and they were made possible by large-scale agriculture. So this part of North America was part of world history just as much as other parts of the world were, even if they and Europe hadn't had contact yet.
Tell me about the great city of Cahokia. I have to admit, I did not know much about Cahokia at all before I picked up your book.
Oh, yeah, and most people don't. It was a major civilization. Its central city was, as I said, right across the Mississippi River from St. Louis, but it also had many satellite cities, including where St. Louis is today. St. Louis's nickname, when it was in its early founding in the late 1700s and early 1800s, its nickname was Mound City, because it still had these relics of this ancient civilization of Cahokia. Now, Cahokia and other Mississippian civilizations all across the Mississippi Valley, they were their central cities had a large leveled plaza, and around that plaza there were mounds or pyramids, but flat-topped pyramids. And on top of those flat-topped pyramids, that's where they built their palaces and their temples and their large government buildings, and the residence, in most cases, of their elite and their leaders. And so by the time white Americans got there in the early 1800s, the only thing that they could see left in most cases was these, what they called mounds. I mean, sort of downgrading them from the word pyramid, right? But that's what was, and I think that's one of the reasons that people don't know about them that much, is that they didn't leave, the Mississippian cities like Cahokia didn't leave large stone, say, edifices. They built their buildings out of wood, and they were long gone. They are long gone, and what remains of them are the remains of their pyramids. Cahokia at its height had tens of thousands of people, which makes it, on par with most cities of Western Europe at the time.
Tens of thousands of people. So
right.
Really, I said in my introduction, but we're talking about real cities.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's not a city today, but that was absolutely a city in 1100.
How important is the Mississippi River to this civilization? And as I was preparing for our conversation, I kept thinking back to the Nile and Egypt.
Yeah, right. Right. Yeah. I mean, like many, most, I guess, of the cities at the time, it was built on a river, so in Cahokia's case, on the Mississippi River. But there were other civilizations that modeled themselves on Cahokia, really all across what's now the American Southeast, and even west of the Mississippi River. So along the Tennessee River and the Ohio River, there were, and the Missouri River, Arkansas River in the west. There were these cities that rose up, and they're clearly there on purpose on rivers. They use rivers for transportation. A lot of the goods that got transported and traded from one civilization to another were transported on rivers in canoes. And so that's, the river was clearly important to these cities, and also for irrigation, for irrigating their crops.
What do we know about its culture?
So we know quite a lot of it. I mean, there are lots of things we don't know about it. It was so long ago, and nobody who lived there left written records. But we can combine archaeology and oral histories that remained with the descendants that are still here today of those civilizations, still Native Americans in the United States today, and also some of the written accounts of what those descendant civilizations were like when Europeans first got here. They were much smaller scale, not living in the grand cities of the earlier era, but they certainly knew about them and were still using the mounds in some cases for religious purposes. So when we combine all that information, we see an awful lot of them were fairly, they were certainly centralized in their economies, and were fairly centralized in their leaderships or their politics and their religion. So it seemed that many of them, perhaps most of them, and certainly Cahokia, had a sort of permanent inherited elite who had the most power and had the most wealth. Who in many cases in these civilizations lived on top of these pyramids. And maybe in Cahokia's case, those people had forced other peoples to move to the region and be a sort of peasant class of farmers. Easy, but there are some oral histories that talk about not perhaps wanting to be part of Cahokia. So they're certainly centralized, powerful leadership who claimed, as many leaders did all around the world at the time, both religious power and political power.
It's oftentimes said that slavery is an ancient practice that goes back to and I'll ask you what you think about the term first civilization in Sumer and how that compares sort of maybe with what we're talking about here. But first question concerning slavery, it's always been said that slavery has been a part of civilization until the modern world. Is there evidence of slavery within the civilizations of North America?
There is some, and I always, when we start talking about slavery in these eras, want to make sure people know we're not talking about antebellum 19th century Southern cotton plantation slavery. And historians talk about that era, that pre-Civil War era, as sort of the height of slavery. Certainly, we probably should call it the depths of slavery, the worst, most inheritable, most brutal, sort of long-term race-based slavery that happens here in the United States much later than this period. But in this era, the 1100s, the 1200s, all around the world, for many, many peoples, enslavement was an answer for what do you do with someone you capture in war that you haven't killed, right? It's a foreigner, it's an enemy, and that person is an enemy. Enslaving that person, forcing them to labor for you, was a common answer all around the world to what do you do with that person. Generally, and I think this is definitely true in North America, in this part of North America, wasn't inherited slavery, wasn't race-based slavery, certainly wasn't cotton plantation slavery, right? But
so you couldn't be born into slavery.
Being born into slavery would have been, not something that would make sense, right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you might be forced into labor in a place and under conditions that you didn't want to be. It's not as if being a war captive was a delightful thing to happen. It was terrible, but it wasn't intergenerational.
So as you said, like slavery, you find throughout most of the world through capture of war, maybe through debt. I don't know if we have any.
Right, exactly. Yeah. We don't know about that for North America, but yeah, that's a really good point. Also, all around the world, there were certain kinds of economic problems, financial problems you might have that would get you into working against your will for someone.
You do describe the economy of these North American civilization. I guess I'm struggling when I keep saying North America because I know I'm excluding Central America here, in which I'm trying to be specific about. So within the bounds of the United States, you write about their economy, that it was something as upside down capitalism?
Yeah, right. That's a phrase that was sort of coined by the historian Daniel Richter. And what it gets at is that, and I should say, this is for after the era we're looking at. So there was this era of huge civilizations, very powerful leaders. Those, as you said in your introduction, those depopulate. People leave those, and so archaeology shows that they depopulated, that people left these places. But oral history gives us some clues as to why. And across many of the descendants of these great civilizations of this earlier era, there are oral histories that tell of a time of crop failures. There's climate change in this era. The climate at the time was actually getting colder, moving into the Little Ice Age that starts at the very end of the 1200s into the 1300s. Oral histories tell of people deciding to either revolt against powerful leaders who had claimed to, say, control the rains and the weather. And when crops failed, it was clear those leaders were not able to do that. Or in even more cases, just leaving. Families, groups getting together and abandoning the cities, abandoning those leaders who'd failed, and building a new way of life, spreading out more, also often on riverways, but in smaller towns without that kind of rigid hierarchy that controlled many of the cities of the previous era. And so that's when this sort of upside down capitalism comes in, and really all across North America, north of Central Mexico is a huge exception to this, right? But in northern Mexico and what's now the United States, and into Canada, the towns, the societies, the communities that developed after that, they really, oral history tells that they decided to live in a different way, in a way that discouraged the rise of tyrannical leaders, and had economies that were based on reciprocity. And sort of at the core of that is, and why we call it upside down capitalism, it's not at all about accumulating wealth. There's power and prestige in these societies. It's not as if everybody's exactly equal, but you accumulate power and prestige by giving away, by being a generous and wise provider to other people. And so the dictates of reciprocity across an astounding number of cultures of Native North America, the dictates of reciprocity say, when I have more, I give more, whether it's me to another individual, whether it's my family to a family that has less, whether it's my town to a town that has less, whether it's my whole society to a town that we trade with that has a crop failure that year. It's my obligation to give more. And part of that is that's insurance. And so when your town, say, has a crop failure, then your trading partner has an obligation to pay back to you, because you've established this long-term relationship of reciprocity. And then we see parallels in other ways that people lived in. These are closer to democracies than most civilizations we would have seen in the 1500s, 1600s around the world. Places that they really emphasize consensus decision making, and all of this is in, I think, to the goal of making sure powerful leaders tyrannical leaders never arise again.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Kathleen DuVal. Kathleen DuVal is a professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and the author of the book Native Nations, A Millennium in North America. This is, I think, very important and part of the book that I was just riveted by as I was going through it. And I think I jumped the gun a little bit by going straight to upside down capitalism and what that term meant. And I probably should have began that by asking about the collapse of some of these civilizations that we are talking about, the collapse of Cahokia off the Mississippi near St. Louis, and also the collapse of the Hohokam in Arizona near Phoenix. I believe in your description of Hohokam, what happens at Hohokam, forgive me, is really fascinating because, and again, climate is also an important part of this story. You have climate changes that are affecting these large cities, and these large cities to be able to provide for themselves. And as this is happening, and I think it is Hohokam, but you'll correct me if I'm wrong, you start to see the construction of sort of walled neighborhoods. And as you were mentioning, more tyrannical kinds of rule.
Yeah. Right, exactly. So there's this period, it's different in different places, but around the 1200s when things get bad, right? There are crops fail. You can imagine around Phoenix, the kinds of irrigation that was required to grow the kind of large scale crops that these huge civilizations could survive on. That kind of large-scale agriculture is made possible both in Western Europe and in what's now the United States because of the medieval warm period. So there's a period where it's warmer, much easier to grow large-scale corn, squash, beans, other crops. That ends in the 1200s. There's a period of droughts, terrible droughts in the Southwest, and then the little ice age comes at the end of that century, or begins to come at the end of that century, and makes all of that more difficult. And so these societies collapse. Yeah, as we said, they fall. And what arises in their place is smaller scale societies that are designed to be more sustainable politically, economically, as well as environmentally.
Yeah, and just again, the collapse and what's happening during the collapse is the building of walls. You see an increase in inequality there in society.
Yeah, that's right. Among the Hohokam, there are as you said, these walled cities, and people. This sort of doesn't sound all that unfamiliar, right? People start to wall themselves off from each other. In Cahokia, there are signs of human sacrifice, that the leaders are sacrificing probably the children of the young people of other societies in religious rituals. There is an increase in differentials of how well people are eating, how diversified their food sources are, just extreme increase in what were already hierarchical societies for the most part, but greater and greater inequality as these civilizations have difficulties with the climate and feeding their people.
How do we see this? Is it Casa Grande in Arizona that's connected to the Hohokam?
Right. Yeah, that's right.
Well, tell me about Casa Grande and how do we know this story about the collapse and what happens during the collapse of the Hohokam civilization?
Yeah, so archaeologists have long puzzled over why these civilizations collapsed. So, for example, why the Hohokam civilizations collapsed. And they know they did because they just see this, like they can date this sort of first, as we were talking about, this rise in inequality that you can see in the literal structure of buildings. And then one of the things that happens in that era also is there had been this elaborate network of ball courts. So playing ball was clearly something that the Hohokam did, and they would travel to other Hohokam cities and play ball there. And that stops. Ball courts get filled in, and in their place get built higher and higher pyramids on top of which the elite are living. So talk about just this huge contrast in the structures that archaeologists can see between a more egalitarian, not an egalitarian time necessarily, but a time that was more concerned about the people and their interconnections to a time that is not about that, right? Where you can't see from the bottom of the pyramid what's going on at the top, right? What kinds of religious ceremonies that your leaders are having and politics your leaders are having. And so there's sort of lost track of your question, but
no, you're right on it. Actually, I mean, it's just sort of like how we know this.
Oh, right, how we know, right. So thank you. So archaeologists wondered about this for a long time, and I'd say didn't really ask the descendants that much. There was a habit of white Americans for quite a long time to assume these were mysteries that could only be solved by white American scientific tools, and even to assume that Native Americans have nothing to do with them. So sort of the racist views of Native Americans would say they weren't capable of having great civilizations. And so naturalists, scientists would sort of puzzle over what might be the answers to these great civilizations, because it clearly can't be Native Americans because they aren't capable of building these things. Now, of course, they were. Native Americans today are the descendants of these civilizations. The various Hohokam peoples of Arizona and the Mexican state of Sonora, they are the descendants of the Hohokam. And so
tell me about the descendants. Today, there are the Odom in Arizona, in northern Mexico. These are descendants of the Hohokam.
Right. They definitely are. And it's in their creation stories, actually, that we have the best answers for why the Hohokam civilizations, the civilizations of their ancestors, fell apart. And they tell it as a creation story. The creation of their own people came out of the fall of this older civilization. And they say the leaders of the Hohokam had taken too much power to themselves. They had led the people into an unsustainable way of life. And the people had to rise up in different creation stories. Sort of exactly what happens can be a little bit different, but basically either another people came in and took down the Hohokam, or the people themselves rose up against the Hohokam. But basically they took down the cities, they took down the leaders, and in their place created the Hohokam, the people who are today, created societies that were more in and are more in tune with living in the Sonoran Desert, they really emphasize balance in politics and economics, as well as in sort of agriculture and feeding themselves. And so they say the answer to the question of why the Hohokam fell is that they weren't sustainable, that they took the wrong path toward centralization, toward tyranny, and lack of sustainability. And our creation story comes out of changing course.
So there is a widespread rejection of cities, of these civilizations that are formed right around 1054 AD. And then there would be several hundred years later, people would actually reject and rebel against that. Widespread from Cahokia to Arizona.
That's right. So, for example, you look in Cherokee oral history. You think about the Cherokees were in Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee, as far as possible from the Hohokam in Arizona, right? They also tell of a priestly class who were sort of the political and religious leaders who took too much power and had to be brought down.
In the Cherokee, tell me about their ancestor. Were they connected to Cahokia, or?
Well, probably not to Cahokia, but probably to one of the other Mississippian societies that similarly had large mounds, very similar to Cahokia.
Because Cahokia would influence
who came from Cahokia and who came from the other ones, because they spread out on purpose.
Yeah, because Cahokia would influence other civilizations around
exactly,
it.
Right.
Yeah.
So either they came from Cahokia, or probably more likely one of the other Mississippian, as archaeologists call them, Mississippian civilizations that was influenced by Cahokia and was much like Cahokia.
And tell me about how the Cherokee rejected.
Yeah, so they tell of revolution, of rising up and leveling the power structure and making sure that it didn't return again, and then creating a politics that was town-based instead. So their Cherokee towns would be affiliated with each other, but not have a leader, a common leader over them who might take power over all of them. They would have town councils, and among the Cherokees and most southeastern peoples and many other Native American peoples, if there was a major decision that needed to be made, not some sort of day-to-day sort of town or farming decision, but going to war, for example, that would require all of the people to get together, and the men and the women and the children, and all talk about whether it was a wise decision or not. And this is, all in the service of making sure that these tyrants don't rise again. And so also telling that story of taking down the tyrants, of revolution. You repeat that in your oral history to make sure it doesn't happen again.
And you do find that in Cherokee oral history as well.
Exactly.
You mentioned the earlier, but you also find it.
Right. Yeah. So that's in Cherokee oral history, and remarkably parallel to what we see in the oral histories of the Otham and other peoples.
So I think this may be a surprise to many people. It was a surprise to me, regrettably, but it was, and I'll be honest about it, to learn that we had in within the bounds of modern day United States these ancient cities, fully formed cities that would rival cities from all across the world of its time, and that then people rejected these cities, moved away from these cities, and then would form a different way of life afterwards.
Yeah. And then what happens is Europeans get here. They see this, what is actually, as we know, this purposefully created, relatively egalitarian way of life with economies that are purposely diversified, right? So they've lived through the beginnings of the Little Ice Age, and so they have actually they still farm. So Native Americans across North America still farmed, but farming was a slightly smaller percentage of their economies. They gathered more, so it was cultivated within the woods and in meadows, other sources of food besides their fields. They hunted more. In many places, they fished more than their ancestors had. Europeans arrive and see this, and they misunderstand it. They think Native Americans are primitive. So for one thing, they misunderstand those societies the way they are in the 1500s and 1600s. They're extremely complicated. I mean, if you've ever tried to do anything by consensus, that is complicated politics, right? These are complicated societies.
And is that also there in the oral history?
Exactly right. Developing ways of making of having a consensus politics, right? And then Europeans see this and they think they're primitive, right? They describe them as they don't know they've ever had cities, and they don't understand the complexity of the societies that they've developed after the fall of cities. And they say, they hunt, they gather. They usually ignore Native American farming because in most Native American societies, women did the farming, and European male observers weren't that interested in what women were doing. So even though they were eating the corn that Native American women had grown, they would sort of write up how, they're not that settled, they're not civilized. And all of this serves European colonizing purposes of imagining that Native Americans aren't settled, right? Don't really own the land. All justifications for colonization, for Europeans to take places that absolutely belong to Native Americans. If you think they're primitive, if you think they're uncivilized, Europeans find it easier to move into their land.
But in effect, Europeans are bringing a form of life, a form of civilization. I mean, their own version, right? These do develop sort of separately on different continents, but still a sense of civilization that wasn't necessarily new to the people of the Americas, but a form of life that they had already rejected.
That's right. That's right. So then, a couple hundred years later, a few hundred years later, in the American Revolution, Americans think they've invented democracy, but democracy's been here for at least for many centuries.
Tell me about the evidence of democracy in ancient indigenous cultures.
Yeah. So these societies that developed in 1200s, the 1300s, they're purposely what we would call democratic. So, for example, some of our best records come from the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois, because they wrote down their laws pretty early on, and after the arrival of Europeans, but pretty early in that process. And so, one of the things you can see in there, so just to describe it, they have so the Haudenosaunee were 5 nations at the time. They're now 6 nations. And so they had a grand council where the nations would send representatives to that grand council, and they would make sort of big decisions that affected all of the nations within. But if you look at how they ran it, you can see reciprocity and democracy deep in how they structure it. So the members of the Grand Council were all men, but they were chosen so the voters were women. They were chosen by the clans of women within each of the nations that were part of the Haudenosaunee. And then those clan women had the power of recall. So if they felt their representative to the Great Council wasn't representing their nation well, their clan well, they could recall him and replace him with somebody they thought would do a better job. And then there are also just all these requirements for sort of public demonstrations of how governing is worked. So governing is not supposed to be in secret. And you imagine these old civilizations would govern in secret, right? The people weren't there in the room, like listening to what was happening. The Haudenosaunee say these things have to be public. People have to be able to witness. Large numbers of people would come to the councils to hear what was happening, to give their opinions. And then within the law, there's all this sort of advice for the people and for their representatives that you can it's just terrific advice for how to run a democracy. So one of them is, if you are the representative of the people, your skin has to be 7 spans thick. Like, you gotta have a thick skin. Like, you cannot get
is that where we get the term thick skin?
What's that?
I wonder if is that where we get the term thick skin?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe so. I'll have to look that up. But yeah, but basically, don't let your sort of personal offend. Don't be offended by another representative or some of the people, and not make the wise decision for your people. The most important thing is making a wise decision. And then there's also advice for the people. For the people, they say, don't go to your representative with your petty complaints. Like, be serious about democracy. Be serious about politics.
Civically minded.
Civically minded, right? Person. And the fact that these things get repeated over and over with different metaphors in the guidelines shows they were human. It's not like they were perfect. They messed up all the time. They were petty and all these things. But their value system, as we know, we don't always live up to our value system, right? But their value system told them, get along, be wise, think about the future. Think about the whole, not just about yourself.
Is there a story that particularly demonstrates that?
So one of the metaphors they use is that we all eat out of a dish with one spoon. So we share, and then this is about probably hunting lands, communal lands where they shared sort of sustenance from. And one of the things they say, we eat with a spoon. We eat with spoon. If we all ate with knives, then this we might cut each other, right? We might have conflict. We eat with a spoon, which is something. This is probably a metaphor that develops later, right, with spoons and knives. But if we eat with spoons, we are less likely to hurt each other, and we have to not do that because we have to share. One story that comes once the Dutch are in New Netherlands, so near the Mohawks. Mohawks are one of the 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois. there's a Dutch preacher who he preaches, and there's some Mohawks there who are listening to it. And after the sermon, he asks the Mohawks, so what did you think? He's hoping they'll say, oh, you're such a great preacher. You gave such a great sermon. And they say, the Mohawks say, we don't understand why you just stood up there and talked and talked and talked, and nobody else talked. That's not the way public meetings are supposed to work. For the Mohawks, for the other Hautenosaunees, and really across most of Native North America, there isn't one person like a preacher, a leader who talks and talks and talks. It's a conversation. Everybody gets a chance to talk. And you think about it, that's the way consensus, that's the way democracy maybe should work. If all of us get a say and no decision happens until we've all talked it through together.
I've spent a little time studying the constitutional debate in Philadelphia, the notes from the debate in Philadelphia, and then also you have the Federalist Papers, which are part of, and the Anti-Federalist Papers that are part of the whole debate. And as you read these things, you feel like what you're actually reading about is ancient history, ancient Rome, ancient Greece, democracy, republics, how they fall, how you keep them from falling, these kind of things. Was democracy that you found within Native tribes within the bounds of modern day United States, was that mentioned at all at these debates or at the time of the Constitution? Was there any influence?
So those are different questions, right? So there's no mention of it. And it's a pretty hotly debated question of whether particularly the Haudenosaunee League, the Iroquois League, affected the making of the Constitution. The people who made the Constitution would say, no, we're looking to Rome, right? That's maybe to Greece, right? We're not their view of Native Americans is not such that they can actually admit that they learn anything from political structures of Native Americans, even though many of them realize that Native American leaders are great speakers, for example. They do, the founding fathers, they know Native American leaders and diplomats. And so I think many of them might say that they are sort of natural Democrats, right? They can't quite, that's Democrats with a small d, obviously, but the natural Republicans with a small r. They, I think the founding fathers tended to believe that Native societies were more primitive than they were and simpler than they were. And they definitely didn't understand the complexity of, say, the Haudenosaunee League and all that it took to run, and all that back and forth we were just talking, that balance we were just talking about. But they definitely knew about the Iroquois. They definitely knew about the Haudenosaunee. They definitely knew that they had that their nations had this common council, which does have things in common with how the 13 states had a Congress together. So
the Iroquois League, has, what's happening with the Iroquois League? What's important to know?
Today?
Then.
You mean? Then, right. So the Iroquois League, the Iroquois and the Haudenosaunee is what they call themselves. Iroquois is what outsiders call them. So they had 5, and by the time of the American Revolution, 6 nations that were part of this league that had this council together. And so Benjamin Franklin and others absolutely knew about that. I think what probably is the safest to say is that Iroquois modes of democracy were known by at least some of the founding fathers, and was in their sort of general worldview, even though they wouldn't have said it was a direct influence on the Constitution or the creation of the Congress.
It's interesting when the Europeans, and I guess we'll talk specifically about the English, and then when we get to the American Revolution, what this means for Native peoples within the bounds of modern day United States. But it's important to note, and the first many decades of the United States, Indigenous people are still ruling most of what we would call United States today.
Absolutely. That's right. So when the Constitution talks about Native Americans, they talk about them for the most part as nations, right? So the name of the book is Native Nations, and that's one of the central points of the book, Native Americans were in nations long before Europeans got here. Europeans and even early in the United States recognized them as nations. At the time of the founding of the United States, had power and most of the population across most of the continent, and also that Native Americans are still in nations today. That there are more than 500 federally recognized tribes in the United States, plus state recognized tribes.
And then, I mean, the American Revolution is so interesting, and now we get different tellings over time of what the Revolution was about. But now it's becoming much more largely recognized that a major impetus for the American Revolution was for land, was for the ability to go take more land. And before the Revolution, England, King George III, has many treaties that were signed with the Indigenous, the native nations, and they largely were respected. And this was a problem for the settlers.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. We don't want to romanticize the British. They definitely could, run over Native Americans when they wanted to. But by the time of the American Revolution, the British, King George, had declared the Appalachian Mountains sort of the western boundary of colonial settlement, and had made these treaties and agreements and proclamations with native nations to the west of the Appalachians, which, of course, if you think about it, is the vast majority of the continent of the United States. Not all of that was claimed by Britain at the time. Much of it was claimed by Spain. But the crown would keep British colonists off of Native American lands west of the Appalachian Mountains, which really just only leaves the new United States, when it's created, as really just hugging the Atlantic. It's not a very big country.
George Washington was a land speculator. Is that just a coincidence, or is that very much a part, you think, of his involvement for the Revolutionary War?
Yeah, it's fundamental to his involvement in the Revolution. He is sent off to the frontier as a young man in command of the Virginia militia to secure land for Britain, and particularly for Virginia, that is being speculated at the time by his older brothers and the governor of Virginia. And they want to make sure that it belongs to Virginia rather than Pennsylvania, and that it belongs to Britain rather than France or the Shawnees or the Delawares or other native nations that claim that region as well. So he's right from the beginning of his military career and into his political career. Land and the eventual expansion of what will become the United States, even though he doesn't know there will even be such a thing at the beginning of his career, is central to his motivation. It just is. Like, he and others of his generation like him, they want to, at the time, tobacco has worn out the land and most of what exists of Virginia at the time, what was Virginia, and they really believe that in order to keep being profitable, sending tobacco and other products to Britain, they need native land. They need to move west.
And it's also it's also at the heart of American democracy too, isn't it? And what I mean by that is, in the early, in the first few decades of American democracy, you needed to own land to vote. In order to have a republic, then you needed people to own land, to be farmers and have their own land, so they could participate in this republic. And what the population was doubling almost every generation.
Yes, exactly. So I think, if you sort of want to shorthand to the explanation of why Native Americans have, why the United States takes so much Native American land in the decades, century after the founding of the United States, it's what you just said. It is democracy plus population. So in the beginning, right, at the American Republic, before we're quite a democracy yet, land holding is required for voting, as you say. They really believe that, they're worried that a republic won't work. And they believe if you have a boss, if you have a landlord, you can't be a responsible citizen. You can't make decisions that are the good for all. You'll have your arm twisted, right, by your boss, your landlord. You have to own your own land. And so,
I mean, this rejection of a king is not so different from what you saw from the native nations before.
Exactly,
Yeah.
right. And they formed this, they're just as worried as native nations were about how do we keep a tyrant from rising to power, right? And so but then that creates this combination of if every American man, and if every American man wants to own his own farm, and the American population is doubling every generation, it is going to be what it was, a force that it will. Americans will think they need new land, need more land. They run their government, right? In a republic, the people get to vote. At least some of the people get to vote, and so leaders follow that impulse to get more land for people. And white Americans don't figure out a way to make those goals and realities compatible with native nations. And instead, they force themselves onto native land. They steal native land and take the continent eventually.
Kathleen DuVal has been our guest. Again, Kathleen DuVal is professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She is the author of the book that she has joined us to talk about called Native Nations, a Millennium in North America. I enjoyed our conversation very much. Let me just say that we just scratched the surface of what you get into in your book. And it is important we only have 50 minutes for a conversation, but important to note that within your work, you also dive deep into how these native nations are still here today.
Right, exactly. I'm glad you mentioned that, because it does. The book itself goes to the present day, but also in every chapter, even the chapters that are dealing with periods of centuries or a millennium ago. I talk to people and bring them into those chapters of the descendants today. And so one of the themes of the book is that Native Americans are still around. They're still around not only as human beings, but also as nations, as polities under the United States and also Mexico and Canada. And so that theme runs through the book as that connection of the past to the present and also the future.
There's really a renaissance going on right now with Indigenous scholars
right.
and writers and historians.
Exactly right. Both within tribes who are really working on language and culture and history within tribes, and then also, as we can see in the wider world, just a tremendous number of public figures as well. And so, one of the purposes of this book is for people who don't know this long history, but do see amazing Native actors and go to their local art museum and see an exhibition of contemporary Native art, to try to help them sort of bridge that gap between sort of not understanding how Native nations got from the long past to today.
Kathleen DuVal, thank you very much.
It's been my great pleasure, Mitch. Thank you for having me on.